So how is Starfield not a typical Bethesda Game Studios game? The simple answer to that question is the map and the way you travel around it. The typical Bethesda game is, Skyrim, Morrowind, Oblivion, Fallout 3. You've got a single world space for the most part. I mean, obviously there are dungeons and places you visit within it, but the main world is a large open space that you can wander around to your heart's content. You are pretty much able to leave the starting area, head off in any direction you want, and refuse to use fast travel if that's the way you prefer to play. This is not possible in Starfield, and indeed I would suggest probably never was going to be possible given the nature of this game. It's a space RPG that spans multiple planets. There was going to be some element of forced fast travel. You were going to get something that was similar to The Outer Worlds or Mass Effect. You were going to have a star map. You were going to be picking a planet, and you were going to be traveling there via, in this case, grav jumping. The thing is, it's more than just grav jumping from star to star. You cannot fly from planet to planet or even planet to moon. In fact, you cannot even fly from planet to orbit or vice versa without essentially fast traveling. And at first, you sort of don't notice it because you're probably spending a reasonable amount of time in one place. But as the game progresses, you will start flying back and forth far more, traveling the systems far and wide, and you begin to notice loading screen fatigue because you'll take off from a planet, loading screen. I mean, there's an animation, but then there's a loading screen. You then get into orbit and you grav jump to a star system and there's an animation, but then there's a little loading screen. You then get to the system and pick a planet and travel to it, and there's an animation, but then there's another loading screen. And then you land on the planet and you get a loading screen and an animation, I think, in that order. If you've never landed there before, you get the animation. And after a while, you just get completely sick of that, and so where possible, you probably want to start just fast traveling from one planet to the next. So if you're the sort of person who doesn't like fast traveling, you're going to be forced to do it. And if you try to minimize the fast traveling, i.e. don't jump from one planet surface to the next planet surface, you'll find yourself doing actually 4 and 5 times more fast traveling technically than the people who just, they're on Jemison and then they click on Aquila so that they can just have one loading screen. It can be very frustrating, but more importantly, it removes that feeling you've got of just wandering like you did in Skyrim. You can't just take off the planet, head into the atmosphere, and then see a moon off in the distance and start speeding towards it. I mean, the argument would be, well, you can't do that in any of the games you've mentioned so far, Mass Effect and Outer Worlds, and this is very, very true. But those games hid it a little better because, generally speaking, you would travel to a location and then you would spend a lot of time there. You would probably exhaust all of the quests in that area and then go to the next one. So it kind of minimized it. In Starfield, it's non-stop. Then, of course, there's the procedural content. Starfield does not restrict you the way Mass Effect or The Outer Worlds does. You can land on a planet anywhere, whereas in those games you land in a very specific place and you have a little handcrafted area you can mess around in. Starfield has basically, it's got places that are obviously handcrafted and you're supposed to land in, but if you want, you can just land anywhere and goof off doing procedurally generated content. Now, I prefer that to the system used in, say, The Outer Worlds, because at least I get a feeling of freedom. Now, I didn't actually engage with the procedural content much in my playthrough. It was over 200 hours, and I probably spent, I don't know, less than 5% of it doing that sort of content. I just had no interest in it. But it was kind of nice that it was there if I wanted to. I wasn't locked in to the crafted areas that I ended up staying in anyway. That was my choice. But I do understand a lot of people see an area they can go to and feel an almost like insatiable compulsion to go and visit those areas and do everything that's there. And of course, everything that's there is procedural content. It's the equivalent of, you know, those quests in Skyrim where one of the quest givers will just give you that repeating quest that you go off and kill someone or go off and find some gem or something, and it just keeps going on and on and on. It's the equivalent of that. And in Skyrim, I think most people recognize it immediately and go, yeah, I'll do that once maybe, I'll do it twice, but I'm not doing it again. I did that in Starfield as a general rule. I could see the procedural content, although I suspect I've probably missed some of the handcrafted things, some of the special encounters purely because I didn't do that, but I'm okay with that. But I do know a lot of people, they see 3 things on the planet, a mining outpost, some building, some crashed ship, and they're like, no, I've got to go there. I have got to do it. I actually understand that. There's something on your map and you need to go there. And when you do, it's just rinse and repeat from stuff you've done 100 times before, I'm guessing. So that is another problem that, of course, Skyrim did not have. The quests, those procedural quests, were specifically triggered by quest givers we could all recognize more or less immediately, and we just ignore. Now, one of the things I've seen said is this game would have been better had they reduced the number of planets and moons you could land on from 1,000 to 10. And I do not agree with that statement at all. At least, I don't think it would have changed the game noticeably. It certainly would not have made it just like Skyrim or a Fallout game. It would still have involved an awful lot of empty space. There is zero chance, and I mean zero chance, that you could handcraft 10 planets the way they handcrafted Skyrim. You just cannot scale up in that manner. A planet is, I mean, even if you use a very similar scale to, you know, Skyrim, you've got to remember that in Starfield, when you land, you're actually restricted to an area. There's an invisible wall if you go far enough. Most people probably won't, but there is an invisible wall if you go far enough. The area you're restricted to is an area the size of Skyrim. You could potentially have hundreds of those on each planet. There is no way they were going to handcraft hundreds of Skyrims on a single planet, let alone 10. It was not going to happen. So even if they did remove 990 of the landable planets and moons, you'd have still ended up with 10 planets with small handcrafted sections on them like Voli, Jemison, Sidonia, well, Mars, sorry, is the planet, etc. You would have had crafted areas like Aquila, Neon, New Atlantis. You would have had those areas handcrafted, and just less planets for you to be distracted by. The planets they were on would still have massive amounts of procedural content. The rest of the planet. Could that have been better for people who don't like being distracted by lots of random empty locations they can just go and grind on? Maybe. Maybe for people who just can't ignore those planets, I get it. It might have felt a little better. But realistically, it would still have been nothing like Skyrim and way more like the Outer Worlds, okay? It would have been pockets of handcrafted areas, maybe the size of a hold in Skyrim, separated onto multiple planets, which is pretty much what it is already. It's just those pockets feel further pushed apart because of all the extra stars and planets planets and moons that you can land on in between. But it still wouldn't have solved the main problem of it just not feeling like a Bethesda Game Studios game when it comes to just, wandering around and discovering things. In fact, I would say the only way I think they could have made Starfield a more typical BGS game, a game like Skyrim, would have been to have had maybe 3 or 4 planets with major cities, and you could not fly your own ship. You had to go to a spaceport and book a passage, and you would essentially fast travel the same way as you would fast travel from Skyrim to Solstheim. And maybe that would have been a great game, but it certainly wouldn't have been the game they envisaged. They wanted an exploration game where you took your ship and you wandered out there. So I don't feel like the Skyrim experience was ever going to happen in a game like this. Does that mean they could not have done a better job with the galaxy and how you travel around it? Hell no. No. I mean, really, it's frustrating because there's a spark of a great idea here. I mean, the fact that you can get your own ship, the fact that you can build your own ships and then fly it into space and you can wander around and dock with spaceships just makes you feel like this could have been a sort of Elite Dangerous or No Man's Sky experience where you felt like you were really genuinely flying around exploring, where you felt like you had freedom, where you felt like you weren't staring at loading screens. Look, I have a ridiculously fast SSD, right? I've got an M2, it's ridiculously fast. I cannot imagine what this game would have been like on a normal SSD, or especially not on a hard drive. I'm guessing you don't even play this game on a hard drive. Those loading screens would have driven me nuts. Yeah, this game hinted at that kind of experience you get in No Man's Sky. I've not played No Man's Sky, I've played Elite Dangerous, but the idea behind those, the idea that you'd take off from the planet in your ship, yourself, controlling it, and then instead of going into orbit, maybe you just wanted to fly along the surface and see what was below you, and see something and think, oh no, I'm going to land there and see what that is, and just land, and then take off and head to the moon. And yeah, the distances you're traveling are excessive, so you weren't going to travel from planet to planet. Well, maybe you could. And I think the game should have allowed you to do this. Head off from the main planet towards one of the moons. And yeah, maybe it takes 20 minutes to get there. Maybe have the option to set autopilot to skip time. But you know what? Maybe I just set the drives to go there, and then I get out of my seat and I wander around and I chat to the people on the ship, or I do some crafting. Or maybe I go and sleep and set the alarm to wake me up when we are close to the planet. That type of thing, where I felt like I was travelling rather than fast travelling. I would have loved to have felt like my ship served more of a purpose than just facilitating fast travel. Oh, and the odd amount of space combat, which I was not a fan of, although a lot of that came down to the fact that they had no joystick support and the mouse and keyboard controls don't work well if you invert Y. Yeah, that's a problem for me, I guess, and maybe other people who invert Y. I found a lot of people who did invert Y who said the exact same thing about the space flight. Wasn't a fan of it. I did get it working with joystick though, and things did improve. But that's it. The ship is just there for those moments of combat, and they're not that in-depth. They're not as fun as, say, Elite Dangerous. And beyond that, it just doesn't seem to serve a purpose. You can have an infirmary. What purpose does that have? You could have all sorts of different things. The only things to have on your ship that seem useful are a cargo, a workshop, and something with a bed. It's like there's not a lot going on with the ship, and yet it feels like there could have been. It feels like you could have had all sorts of conveniences and benefits. I feel like the settlements in Fallout 4 were way more useful than the ships. Don't even get me started on the outposts. The outposts are a completely throwaway. You can just totally and utterly ignore the outposts. But the ships, they're fun. They are. Building your own ship is fun. And it should have been the case where I just loved flying around in it. Just landing on the planet, landing my big, huge, enormous, ridiculously clumsy looking ship on a landing pad and hoping I didn't crash into one of the towers and get myself like a bounty or something. There should have been something like that. I feel like the game was hinting at being a No Man's Sky, an Elite Dangerous, with a Bethesda RPG on top of it. And it's not. It's a Bethesda RPG that's been cut up, separated, and then fast travel lanes put between all the different areas. And that just does not work. It certainly isn't typical Bethesda, and honestly, it's probably one of the worst things about the game. And before you ask, I don't think it's something that can be fixed by mod makers. I think this is a fundamental limitation of the engine they are using. I'm using that word, the engine, very generically to mean, the game and the structure it's built upon. I'm not one of these people who's been calling for them to, start from scratch, get a new engine as the call goes out, because I didn't think that was necessary to make, say, the next Elder Scrolls 6. If they decide to make Starfield 2, and I kind of hope they do, they need a new engine. The current one cannot scale. It cannot scale in the way you need it to simulate a galaxy. The engine's hit its limitation with a country. That's your limit. That's where you're at. Skyrim was your limit. The Commonwealth was your limit. That engine can't handle a planet. It can't even handle a small moon, let alone a galaxy. Bethesda need to get some people in who know how to make that sort of engine, that sort of game. They need to come up with an engine that doesn't have as many loading screens. And I think it might be a good thing for them all over. I mean, look, we're not getting it with Elder Scrolls 6. I know the Elder Scrolls 6 is probably locked in now. We're getting it on the current engine, air quotes. And the same is probably true for Fallout 5. But if they want a Starfield 2... There's a little side of me doesn't want Starfield 2 because they've got too many IPs on the go. Bethesda needs to expand. They do. They need to expand so they can crank out more games. But honestly, new engine for Starfield 2. Make it so that you can No Man's Sky it, but with a Bethesda RPG on top of it. That is a game I would really love to play. And so that's it. It's a tale of two sides of a coin, so to speak. The side where it is a typical Bethesda Game Studios game, good and bad, and then the side that's completely different. And that side, I'm not saying it was completely bad, but it just didn't quite work. It didn't get it right. And it's a shame because I actually enjoyed Starfield and I'm still going to play it more. I've done a 200-hour playthrough. I'm playing through on NG Plus to see what the differences are. And I do want to play a completely different character. And because there are two main factions I've not even touched. I've got a load of crafted content to still discover. Loads of side quests I missed because they were inappropriate for the character I was playing. There's tons left for me to do, and I want to do it. And I have to say, this is a positive development after Fallout 4. Because really, with Fallout 4, I felt like I'd pretty much played 90% of the game on a single playthrough and didn't have the same urge to play multiple times, to play different characters, to do different content, because I almost didn't feel that latter was that possible. So, in conclusion, I'll say I much preferred Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind and Fallout 3. They were better games for me, in my opinion, but I prefer Starfield to Fallout 4. purely because of the main quest. Well, mostly because of the main quest. I did also prefer the dialogue system in Starfield. I'll tell you what, there were some improvements. I mean, they went back to a more Skyrim-esque system in the dialogue, but I loved the persuasion minigame. I thought that was a great idea in theory. It quickly became obvious the more I played that they hadn't followed through well with this idea, because a lot of the lines were generic, often felt like they just didn't really fit the conversation I was having, and just, I don't know. They definitely did not feel handcrafted, and they did not feel like a good conversation in the end. But the system itself, I think, was a really good idea. I think they should just lean more into it and actually have persuasion choices that really make sense and branch from each other in a way that makes sense. Yes, it would take a lot of time. Yes, they would need to get more voice lines recorded, but I actually think that would have been one of the standout features for this game had they, managed to execute it well. The dialogue overall I was happy with. In Starfield, I think they really leaned in to dialogue, and I want to see more of that. Elder Scrolls 6, I want to see that sort of thing enhanced. I want them to stick with the main quest that is not dominating. So a lot of positives. And it's not that I didn't want them to bring anything from Fallout 4. They brought the crafting system over, which was great. Except they tried to make it more complicated and difficult and annoying. This was partly because of the requirements, the components you needed. It was way more complicated and annoying than in Fallout 4, but also because of the character build system. Just unlocking... I mean, to be honest, there's an entire other video on the character build system. In fact, I'm just going to leave that for another... I didn't like the character build system. I'll do an entire video about that one. But yet there was things like that, the crafting. They brought over the settlements from Fallout 4, and... I'm not even sure why they bothered. It just serves no purpose at the moment. I mean, people say it probably did, but it was cut content. It doesn't get in the way, though. You can completely ignore it, so that's a good thing. But now I'm just babbling more. Look, at the end, I can say I really did enjoy Starfield. I'm still enjoying it, and it gives me hope for The Elder Scrolls 6. Bethesda seemed to be listening to the community. They obviously reversed certain design decisions they went with in Fallout 4 because of the outcry, and I see this as a good thing. Hopefully they will continue to listen. They will absorb what people have said about the procedural generation and the fast travel nature of the game, and they will go back to a more traditional world space for The Elder Scrolls 6. But beyond that, there is still hope for a Starfield 2 that could be the game that Starfield should have been, but it will require an investment in, well, essentially new technology, a new engine that can scale up the way they want to be able to scale and still keep that feeling of being connected to the universe you're traveling through, rather than connected to a bunch of bloody loading screens.
This is where we belong.